Now, I know we just built a hats page in order to show some of the routing that we can build. But the next thing we actually need to do, according to our final application, is build a shop page. Now, on this shop page, what we have are these previews of our collections. There are always 4 items in our preview, and there's a link to the actual category page. So if we click it, it'll take us to the page that has all of the items listed, and you'll notice that they actually use the exact same item component in the shop page. So what we're going to build is we're just going to set up a shop page and set up our collection previews on our shop page. So we're going to build a component for our shop page itself. We're going to build the component for our actual collection preview. And then we're going to build our collection item component. So let's get started. Now, the first thing we need to do is build the actual shop page. So let's make a new shop page file and folder inside of our pages. So let's do shop.component.jsx. And because we need to store the data related to our actual collections on our shop page, we're going to make our shop page a class component. So we're going to import React from React, and we're going to do class shop page extends react.component. And we know we need access to our state. So let's do a super props. And this dot state equals an object where our collections is going to be equal to an array that I have provided for us that has the information related to these collection items. We will take that array and paste it into our object. So now, this does look pretty big, especially because this is going to be our default state. So what I'm going to do is move this into its own file because it's going to be static and it's not going to change, at least for now, according to our application. And it'll be easier for us to focus on the main thing that matters about our shop page, which will be the component itself and its lifecycle methods. So let's make a new shop.data.js. And we are just going to export shop data, which is equal to that array. And let's actually capitalize this. Shop data. Export default const shop data. I think we just got to put it at the bottom. So let's just declare our const and then export default shop data. There we go. Okay. Now let's import it in like this. And let's import in shop data from. And now instead of this huge array, we'll just point to our array like so. And then in our render, we are going to return a div for now that just says shop page. And we'll just make sure that everything works first before we continue building out our actual shop page. So let's export default our shop page. And now inside of our app.js, we have to import our shop page from pages/shop/shop.component. And we're not going to style our pages yet. We're actually going to do that later. Let's just set up the base structure of our actual application. So instead of hats page and hats, we're just going to make sure we go to shop. And we're not going to use this hats page anymore because we were just using it earlier to demonstrate linking and routing. Now we will have to modify our final data that we actually had before, but for now, let's just not worry about it. We just need our shop page to be connected. So let's see if it works. And let's go back to our application and navigate to /shop. And we see our shop page. Awesome. Now, what we need to build is this preview component next, right? This preview collections component. So let's go into our components and let's add a preview collection component. And inside of our preview collection component, we need both the preview collection component itself as well as the styling related to it. Styles.sass. And now inside, we need to import React from React, as well as the style sheet. And then we need to actually declare a functional component for preview collection. And what we want to return in our preview collection, actually, let's call it collection preview. I think that makes a little bit more sense. And we got to remember to also update our imports. And what we'll end up returning is a div that with an outer div that contains our entire collection. And inside, there's a title, as well as the actual items themselves. So those items will be held in a div, and that will be our actual preview, whereas this will just be the overall collection preview. And our title, we will have it as title. And inside of our preview, we will end up mapping over the items. So now that we have an idea of what it's going to look like, we need to figure out what we're going to pass in. So we know we need the title. We know we want a title being passed in for our props. And we know we want it always to be uppercased. And then we know we want to map over an items array that we get in. It'll always be 4, but it will still be a map of some kind. So we are going to do an items.map. And we are going to map with the item. And we are going to render, for now, just a div with the item.name of the item. Oh, gotta remember those curly braces. Now, I think in our actual shop page component, our data has name. Yes, and it has an ID. So let's use the ID inside of our collection preview as the key. Item.id. So we'll just do this for now, just so that we have an idea that everything's working. So export default collection preview. And we'll also need to import this into our shop page. So let's import it in from our components, collection preview, collection preview. And this will be collection preview from here. So now, instead of a shop page, we will want to render out the actual previews. So inside of our container div, that is our actual homepage, or sorry, actual shop page. Let's just give it that class name of shop page. Let's do actually let's destructure our collections off first. So now we have to map over our collections with the collection. And let's render out a collection preview where the key is the collection ID. So if we look at the data, we'll see on the actual items of our collections themselves, there is an ID and a title. Now we want access to this ID. So let's actually destructure this off. And then we'll do the same thing we did last time, where we do other collection props, because we'll need them later. So for our key, we're going to pass the ID, and then we're going to spread in other collection props. And what we will actually spread in is going to be the items, the title, and then the route name. This is not going to matter. We just mainly need the title and the items. Now I think we actually have title and items. Awesome. So now if we look at our application, we should see that we are rendering out all of our information. Now, we do need to modify this data so that it only displays 4. So we're going to do that inside of this collection preview. So when the items come in, we're just going to do a items. Let's do a filter. We're just going to do item and index. And we just want to make sure that our index is less than 4. And now if we save, we should see there's only 4 items. So now the beautiful thing about writing our code functionally like this is that we can just modify our array, pass that new array through, right? And we can chain these array methods. Now, the only thing to keep in mind here, and this is something to keep in mind about React, is that whenever this component gets rendered, this function call, this chain of modifications to our array gets called every time, as long as this component has to re-render. So this is going to be a performance concern if this array ever gets really large or on slower computers. But we will take a look at how to handle this a little bit later. But definitely a thing to remember is that all of these anonymous function calls, right, inside of any component do get called again and re-rendered brand new whenever this component either gets rendered or re-rendered. Now that we have all of this in the next section, we're actually going to style this stuff. Okay, so now that we have our collection preview, we need to start looking at building our menu item component. So we know that our menu item component is going to consist of an image, as well as a title, a price, and this button that allows us to add it to the cart. Now, we're not going to actually add any of the functionality in just yet. We haven't really considered how to handle our cart yet. But let's just build out this component first. So let's add in a collection item into our components. And in our folder, we're going to do the same thing we've been doing. Our collection item.component.jsx. And then our collection item.styles.scss. The more you type this, the better you'll get at it. Which is always what's really interesting, is that at first it always seems a little repetitive, but you actually find that you really do end up remembering everything and what their purpose is the more you practice typing the same folder structure for your components and what to do with them. Okay, so now for our collection item, we know that we need certain things to come in order to populate our menu item, but we don't need any state. So let's make another functional component. So const collection item is equal to this functional component that returns this div with our class name collection item. And then we're going to give it a div. And now that div is going to hold our image. So let's just give it the class name of image for now. And let's do the same thing we did before with our directory items. So instead, we know that what we're going to pass in will be an ID, We will also get our name. We will get our price and our image URL. And we have all these when we brought in that data earlier in our collection, or sorry, in our shop page, right? In our shop data specifically. So we need an ID, name, image URL, and price. Now we are going to put in what we did before with our style, and we are going to do background image goes to our string interpolation value of image URL. So nothing new here just yet. And then we're going to add another div. And here we're going to add our collection footer. Now, inside of our footer, we have, is this a double repeat? Actually, we don't even need this closing tag. We are going to bring in our span, which will be our name, as well as our price. Awesome. Okay. Now, let's export this out. And let's bring in the styles that we have for this component. So I've written them already for us, but we can take a quick look at what they are. So, inside of our collection item, we are styling our image so that its height is 95%. Now, that means that our collection footer's height will be 5% of the total height of our collection item, which will be 350 pixels. So this is pretty much going to be the layout for our actual component, what we see here. So one important thing to note is that this flex column on our collection item will essentially allow our footer and our image to sit in a vertical alignment, right? And then our collection footer is just our regular display flex. And then we have some space between them so that our content gets pushed apart. Our title takes up 90% of the space in our total footer. And then the price is going to be 10%. So because our price is probably never going to grow that large, we got to make sure to have our name take up the majority of the space here. Okay. Now, if we import in our collection item to our collection preview so that we can access the new collection item we wrote, we can now, instead of doing this div, just map it through like so. And because we need the properties on the item that we had before, we're just going to do what we did earlier. And we're going to destructure off our ID, but we're also going to destructure the rest of our item props and pass that through like so. Let's do other item props. Whoops. And now it's no longer a div. We'll just make sure to destructure or spread our other item props into our collection item. Oh, we also have to style our collection preview. So those stylings are down here. Okay, there we go. So we have our price and we have our thing. Because there's no styling coming through, let's just inspect quickly and see if we're missing something. So while you code, you might see this happen. You just want to make sure that our naming is correct for everything and we're getting the styles. So I don't see the styles that we wrote being applied here. Although we are getting the actual image right here being rendered. So, oh, I see. Our collection preview, our collection item. Oh, we didn't save. There we go. Silly mistakes. So sometimes if you just take a look inside of your DevTools, it's very easy to see where perhaps we are going wrong, because we know for sure, due to the way that React is set up, everything should be in at a specific time. So if it's not being loaded, then we probably messed up our import, right? Which we checked first, right? We made sure that we were importing in the right collection item, which we were. And then we checked if we had our naming, like our class names correct, which we did. So then it just turned out we didn't save it. So it's a silly error, but there's tons of those as you become a professional developer. A lot of the times you'll find that you're just banging your head against the wall for 30 minutes only to find out that you had a slight typo. It's very common. But just like that, we now have our collection component. So the only thing we're missing is the hover effect with the add button, but we can add that in a little later when we actually build out our cart, because that's what that feature will be tied to. And one more thing before we commit our code, we should add a little bit of padding on our overall project so that it aligns closer to this. So let's go into our app.css and let's do padding 20 pixels and 80 pixels. So I want 20 pixels on the top and the bottom, and then 80 pixels on the side. And now it looks closer. So this may be a little bit more than what we had. So let's actually make this 60 pixels maybe. It's a little better. That's pretty good. So now let's commit our code. Let's go back to our terminal. Let's do a git add. All right, let's see what we first have to commit. Okay, git add, and then let's do git commit. Updating our app with a shop page, collection preview component, and collection item component. And now let's just git push origin master. Okay, our code is up. Now let's move on. Okay, now that we have our menu item and our shop page, what we're going to build is our header. We need an easier way to navigate between our pages, and we want to build this component in such a way so that it's always present, no matter what page we navigate to. Now, we want to do it in such a way that we don't have to put header on every single page component that we have, but that's really easy with React Router DOM. Now, before I show you that, let's just build the header component. Now let's go back to our application and let's create a header component. And in our header component, we are going to have the usual suspects. We need a header component.jsx and a header styles.sass. And in our header component, we're going to import React from React. And we're going to import our style sheet in. Now, our header component is going to be a functional component. And it's going to have a div that contains our header code. And this code is going to resemble pretty much exactly what we see. So it's just going to be an outer container, this group of option links that we have over here that will be contained in that group option link container, and then a logo. So what we're going to add here is a class name of header. And then we are going to create our logo. So our logo will link to the home page when you click it. And the way we do that is we import in link from React Router DOM. And then we will just put link in with the 2 pointing to our homepage route. And we do want to use our actual icon, but I've provided that for us in the format of an SVG. And SVG icons are essentially scalable vector graphics, which are really small, really performant, but look the same no matter how large or how small that image is expanded. And that's really great. And I have that for us right here. So you can just copy it from the file that I've provided in this lesson. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to make a new folder in our source called assets. And in it, we are just going to paste. Okay. And you'll see a bunch of code that actually represents the crown SVG. But in our header, we're just going to import this into our component. And we're going to import from assets/crown SVG. And what we're going to write is React component as logo. Because it's not a JSX file, we don't actually set the import. We're just importing in this SVG as this React component keyword, but we're setting it to the logo keyword. And by doing this, we are now able to place it right here. And we can also give it the class name of logo. And our class name for our link will be logo container, because we want that container to have some style on it as well. Now, our options will be held in their own individual options container, and they will also be links. And they will point to our shop and have the class name. And inside, this first one will be our shop. And then our second one will be content. And then we just export it out. And we just bring this into our app.js. Now, once we import this in, components header component, all we have to do is just place this header outside of the switch and the routes that contain all of our page components. Because by doing this, our header is always present and rendered despite whatever React Router DOM switch component and route components decide to render onto the page. And this is really great because if we had, say, pop-ups or overlays or footers that we were always wanting to display in our application, or at least be on the page, regardless of what path the user is on, we would just do it like this. And this is really, really awesome because this makes our app very intuitive. It looks very composable. Because we know all of our pages exist here, and our header exists outside of this switch. Okay, now if we go to our application, we'll see that we have what looks like the header, just no styling yet. So let's write the styles. Now, I do have them actually written already. Our header, which is the containing div, has a width of 100% and a height of 70 pixels. We set a display flex so that when we put justify content space between, the children inside of this parent, so our logo container and the options, will be pushed apart as far as possible with any remaining space that they themselves don't take up as far as the width is concerned. So there's a margin bottom that pushes our pages 25 pixels down from anything below the header. And then our logo container just has a width of 70 pixels, whereas our options has a width of 50%. So it always takes up 50% of whatever width the header is. And they align everything centered, and they're always on the flex end. So justify content flex end means that we want to always set them so that they are on the most right side of the component. So they're on the end of the actual flex box. And then our options have some minor padding so that they are not so grouped together. And now if we look at our code, we see that our crown takes us to the home, our shop takes us to the shop, and we have a very basic version of our header setup. We haven't added the contact page yet, but we will do that at the very end. What we should do though is we should modify our link tags that we use as our options to not have this underline or this purple color that comes with an A tag. Now, even though it's a link component, if we inspect it, we see that what gets rendered is this A tag, right? This native A tag. So we know that React Router DOM actually modifies the A tag and then gives it the functionality inside of itself to do the behavior. So in order to do that, we have to actually modify our app.sass, and we can do this right here by setting text decoration to none and the color to black. We could just target selectively the link itself inside of our header component by targeting, say, anything with a class name of option, but we want it so that none of our A tags actually have this text decoration, because we will probably never use a native A tag. So if we save, we will see that it is now updated. Okay, now the last thing we need to do is just commit our code before we finish styling our header, because in the next section, we will be including our sign-in page and our sign-in button. So let's go back to our terminal. Let's see what we have. So we'll just add our code, adding header component and links to home, the shop page, and then we'll just get origin master. Okay, now let's build that sign-in.
Hey everyone, it's Andre again. I just wanted to talk quickly about the upcoming videos. You see, we're going to start working on our sign-in page. And sign-in is something that is extremely common all across apps. Throughout your career, you're for sure going to need to create some sort of a sign-in form. Now, sign-in is a combination of creating forms, like this, and also doing something called user authentication, where we're able to register a user and also check if a user exists and let them sign in. Over the next couple of videos, we're going to try and solve this very common problem, and we're going to try and show the best way to do it with React, as well as later on using some sort of backend storage using Firebase to actually get this feature to work. Now, over the next couple of videos, we're going to assume that you know basic HTML forms. If you don't, I'll link to this resource so you can read up on it. But we assume that HTML forms is something that you're quite familiar with. And you're also familiar with things like event prevent default. And what you will see in the next couple of videos is a very common pattern that you'll use not just with this project, but with future projects as well. So when you see things like event prevent default and maybe you don't understand it, again, it's always good to make sure that you stop, pause, and maybe Google around. But for example, prevent default is used to stop the default behavior of an HTML form and potentially hijack it or prevent something from happening so we have more control over. But the most important thing that we're going to talk about, and something that you'll carry with you throughout your career, is this. As we're building this sign-in and register functionality, these 3 points are going to be really evident. And I want you to really pay attention on what we're going to do to make sure that we create these components and the functionality using these 3 principles. For example, when it comes to deciding on components, we'll see that we have forms that are quite similar. We have buttons that are quite similar. Instead of coding them each individually, we're going to have components that are flexible enough to be able to use just one React component and style it or form it in different ways. Remember, React is all about reusable components. If we take a look at the code, which you're going to write over the next couple of videos, again, you won't have this yet. When we work on the sign-in component, we're going to get to a point where we have this form input component that we're going to create ourselves, a custom component, so that we go from having a simple HTML input component to something that is flexible, that we can pass in different properties to customize to our liking. For example, a register and a sign-in component. We also have a custom button where we can give it different customizations. In this case, it's only the sign in, but this custom button can be used with our sign in with Google as well as the sign up eventually. So you're going to see how to decide on these components, how to make them reusable across our different app. But more importantly, we're going to really figure out these two things, deciding where the state should live and what changes when state changes. Again, this is code that we're going to write together. But you'll notice that we have a handle submit method and a handle change method. The one method is going to happen whenever somebody is typing information in the input box where we update the state. And another one, which is the handle submit, which will handle when somebody clicks on one of these buttons. So we're going to start with basic input HTML syntax and basic button HTML syntax to creating these custom reusable components that are able to react to user changing the state of the application. And the final thing I want to mention is this. Where do you think the state for the form lives? This is a very common problem with React. For example, we're going to have a sign-in page, as you can see here. And this sign-in page will be an entire component that contains these two forms. Now, each of these forms will have its own component. One will be the sign-in component, one the register component. But here's my question. If this was our sign-in page, and this was our sign-in, and this is our register, where should the state live? Where should the information that the user types in, for example in here, where should it live? Should it live in this component? Should it live in this component? Or should it live in this entire page component? Pause the video and think about that. Ready for the answer? The easiest way to think about this is to lift up the state only up to the point that the components need it. So when we create this component, we're going to actually keep the state in its own individual component. So sign in is going to have its own state and register is going to have its own state. Why is that? Well, because these two things don't need to talk to each other. Sign in doesn't really care what we enter in register. And register doesn't care what's in the form of sign in. So if we lifted the state up and kept the state in the entire page, every time we update this and the state changes, both of these would get re-rendered. So that means 2 extra calculations that React has to do to re-render this and re-render this. If we kept state just in the sign-in, because that's the only place that we care about those changes, only this component is going to get re-rendered when we type something in here or click submit instead of this over here. Now, I want you to just notice this as we're building it, that Ihua is going to make these decisions and try to keep state to the lowest possible level, keeping the concern in place to whatever component needs it so that we're more efficient with your code. This is something that will come with practice. But remember, over the next couple of videos, notice how Ihua is going to keep these 3 principles in mind and build out the components. Let's get started.
Now that we have our header, the next thing we're going to build is our sign-in page. Now, if we look at our finished application and we look at the sign-in page, we see that there is a sign-up section and a sign-in section. They're quite similar with their own custom form input component and a custom button component. So before we attach any of the functionality to this component, let's take a look at what functionality we have available. So we can actually sign in using an email and password, and that sign-in is going to be based off of the accounts that we're signing up using this form. So if a new user signs up using this form, we are able to sign in with that account. Alternatively, if this step is too extensive, then we can just sign in with Google. And by using sign in with Google, we load any Gmail accounts that the user is currently logged into, or they can add another Gmail account and log in that way and authenticate into our application with very minimal effort. So let's begin. How do we build this? Well, first, let's just set up the page. So let's go back to our application and let's build a sign in and sign up page. So let's create our folder, sign in and sign up. Let's copy that text because we are going to have to write this twice, .component.jsx, and then also .styles.sass. Now, we just have to import in all of the usual things that we always have to, including our style sheet. And then we are going to use a functional component here. And the reason we're going to use a functional component and not a stateful class component is because we're going to keep all of that on our sign in and sign up components respectively. And then we will just write sign in for now. Export default. Export our component. Save it. And now import it into our app.js. Oh, these are leftovers that we don't need from our import. So let's pages. And now let's duplicate this route for sign in using our new component. And now if we navigate to sign in, we see our page. So now let's build our sign in component first before we build our sign up component. Now, the reason we're going to build our sign in component first is because we're going to set up our Firebase database in the next section. And that is what we're going to use in order to handle any of our authentication as well as signing up users. So sign in is easier to explain if we do it with Firebase first, and I'll show you why. So let's first just make our files. Sign in.styles.sass. And for our sign in, we are going to use a class component because we have to store what the user's typing in. So let's do class sign in extends react.component. And in our constructor, we are going to need access to state. And on our state, what we're going to store is an empty string for our email and an empty string for our password. In our render, we are going to return a div that contains our entire sign-in component. And in it will be an h2 for the title. So here we're going to say, I already have an account. And then let's use a span for our subtext where we will say, sign in with your email and password. Awesome. Now for our actual form, we're going to use a native form element. And in it, so we have custom components here that we're not going to use yet. We're going to code those out later. But first, I'm just going to put in an input with a name of email and a value of email, this.state.email. And then I'm going to set required to be true. And then we're going to add a label that says email. And we're going to repeat this twice.
so that this one will say password. This one's type will be email as well. And this one's type will be password. And then at the end, we will have a input with a type of submit. And here we will set the value to be submit form. Let's export this out as the default. So this is all just very basic setup for now, right? We don't actually have any of the bindings to the code. But what we're going to need to add is we are going to add on our form an onSubmit function that calls our method handleSubmit, which for now will simply prevent the default submit action from firing, because we want full control over exactly what this submit is going to do. But for now, what we'll do is we will prevent it, and then we will clear out our fields. So we'll set our email and our password back to an empty string. And that's what we will pass here. handleSubmit. And as for our actual inputs, what we're going to do is we are going to set a onChange value to point to our handle change function, which also again takes an event, except for this we are going to pull both the value and the name off of our event.target. The event target will end up being our input element itself, and we want the name value that we just set as well as the actual value on that target that they've just typed in. And what we're going to do is we're going to dynamically set our state so that it sets that name. So it'll render whatever that value that comes in will be. If name is password, it will say password and then point to the value that they typed in. And then the same will apply for email. If it's the email, then this event targets.name will be email, and then that value will be what they're typing in there. So this way we can pass the same function into the same input. And this is awesome because we don't have to write separate functions that do pretty much the same thing by dynamically setting our property value. Now let's import this into our sign-in page. Sign in from components, sign in, and let's just render this out and take a look. Awesome. So there we go. There's our form. We hit our submit form. It clears the fields. Exactly what we're looking for. Okay. Now let's actually style this and attach the functionality. Okay. So in order to style this, we're going to take this section by section first. First, we're going to style the input, and then we'll style the button, and then the full component, just so it ends up looking like our final sign-in. So what we have to do is we actually have to make a new form input component, and it's going to perform the exact same way as a regular input, but with our own styling on it, including managing the label and that little micro interaction when you click on it. So, how do we do this? Well, let's first make a new component called form input. And we're going to make our form input.component.jsx and a form input.styles.sass as usual. And inside of our form input, it will be a functional component, because we don't want any state on this component. What it will take is it will take a handle change prop, a label,
and then the rest of the props we're going to destructure, because we're going to spread that into the input. Now, the reason why we need this handle change is because we want to bubble up any on change that the input has. But we're going to wrap our whole component in a group because we want the label and the input to be together. So this is going to be called a group. And then there will always exist an input. And the input will have the class name of form input. On change will then bind our handle change. So right now this looks exactly like how we had it earlier inside of our sign-in component. We're still just binding whatever handle change gets passed in onto the on change. And then we're going to spread the other props here. So all these other props will end up being all of the props that we've passed in here, including name, type, value, required. Those are all going to get passed into our form input component as the other props. Now, why do we need this label prop? Well, with this label prop, we are actually going to selectively render a label because we don't know if we actually need it or not. If a user passes in a label, right? Or sorry, if a developer, if we want to pass in a label property, then we'll generate one. If we don't, then there's no need for it. So we are going to create a label component. Otherwise, we are going to render nothing. And null is a great way for nothing to appear. So here, what we're going to render is our label with a class name of this value. So what we're going to do is we are going to selectively render a string interpolated value where we take props.value.length. So if our value is in, then we are going to apply this class of shrink. Otherwise, it will be an empty string, and we will always have form input label. Other props. So this label will always have the class name, form input label, but we will also add this shrink property whenever the user has typed anything in. Now, this is mainly for certain browsers that will autocomplete when you get to that portion of the actual sign-in page. I'm going to show you what I mean, but we're also going to render the label text. Now, as usual, I've provided the styling for us. And I'm just going to quickly take a look at what is here. So what we're saying is that this is a sass variable. Wherever we call subcolor is going to substitute into that gray. Wherever we call main color, it's going to substitute in black. And then this mixin shrink label is an easy way for us to include this whole block of CSS where everywhere we say @include and then that shrink label, that mixin. So mixins are kind of like reusable pieces of CSS that we can put inside of our Sass code. And this way we don't have to repeat the same thing, and if we wanted to change anything, we could just modify it here, and wherever it's being referenced, it'll update. Now, the main thing to focus on that we've changed is that we want to focus whenever a user focuses, which is whenever they select or whenever the browser is focused on that input, then we want to target the form input label and we want to include shrink label, right? So we want to move it up, change the font size, and change the color. Because right now, our label actually sits inside of our component, as you'll see here. Right? It just sits right above the actual input itself. So by doing this, we are adding a transition right here of 300 milliseconds. so that the moment these properties get updated, there's a transition of 300 milliseconds to that change. And now if we save and we export our form input, if we add it into our sign-in component, we will see our new component in our code. Form input from form input component. Now let's just replace this with this, like so. And now instead of an on change, we are going to add in our handle change, because that's the name that we decided to call our property. And now if we look at our code base, we'll see that this is our new component. So we also need to now add in our label. So here I'm going to say email. And then for this label, I'm also going to say password. If we save again, let's not update that password. We see our functionality. Awesome. So let's get rid of this label and this label. And now our form input looks how it should. So why is the width full? And it's because it always just expands the full width of our component. So for our sign-in component, we can actually also add some styling here so that the width is always 30 view width. So it's always 30% of the total view width. And now we have a better looking component that looks way more similar to our final. Okay, now let's style the button. Now that we have our form input component, we also want a button component that's custom. Now, this button is also going to be a presentational component similar to our form input. And the reason why we're building them as their own component is so that this component can be used in any other component that might need consistent input styling that we have across our application. So what do I mean by this? Well, up till this point, we've pretty much limited all of our styling for our titles and our menu items and our collection items all in this or whichever respective component that they're in. So any styling for the homepage sits in the homepage styles.sass file. But now we're running into components that we know are going to be reused across the application. So if we look at our final application, we see that we're going to use the button in our sign-in, we're going to use the button in our sign-up, and we're also going to use our form input across both the sign-in and the sign-up. So limiting our form input styles to just the sign-in would cause us to have to repeat that same style code inside of our sign-up as well. But we don't want to do that. We want to make components that we can reuse across our application. And even our button is used in more than just our sign-in page. We know it's going to be used inside of our checkout, and we see that this is actually inversed. So it's going to have to be a pretty flexible button. Including in our shop, we use something similar as well. So how are we going to build this? Well, first, let's just start with building our sign-in button for our sign-in page. We'll add the functionality as we require it, because this way it allows us to reevaluate and properly consider the trade-offs of how we should build our button. So let's go back to our component. And let's add in this new custom button component. And let's just make custom button.component.jsx and custom button React.styles.sass. We'll import React. From React, we'll import in our style sheet. And then we're just going to export a stateless functional component called custom button. And it's just going to render a button component. And then we're going to attach the styling to our custom button class name. Now, you might wonder, if this is a button, but in our actual sign-in component, we were using an input to do our HTML form submission, how would it continue to work if we switch it to a button? Well, for both button and input, they can both take this property of type submit, and they can both submit the form that they're in. They'll both trigger, when clicked, if they have the type submit, the onSubmit method on our form. So what we want to do is we want to be able to pass that in. So what we'll do is we'll first pull the children off of our props that get passed into our custom button. And then we're going to destructure all the other props into this other props property and spread that into our custom button. Now, if we have a type submit being passed into custom button, the button will get that. And then we'll put children inside of our button component. And now, if we export our custom button, and then we add in our custom button styles, which I have provided right here, we can now import our custom button into our component and replace this input with it. Now, instead of doing a value here, because we have children, we're just going to put sign in like so. And now we have our button. There's a little bit of styling we need to add to our sign-in component itself. And what we will do is we will go to our sign-in styles. And we're just going to add a display flex, a flex direction of column, because we want all of our elements inside of our sign-in to sit vertically. And then we're also going to add a bit of a margin between our title. So we're going to put margin of 10 pixels on the top and the bottom. And now we have our sign-in component. So next, we're going to start integrating with Firebase, and that is going to be a really exciting lesson.